Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's show. We're going to have something different this week. We're going to include our guest from the show to talk about the show, Professor Joseph Ellis, who has given me permission to call him Joe. And hey, Joe.
Hey there. Hi, David.
So the subject this week was fascinating. You talked about the few and the many.
We did. And, one of the things that struck me, Joe, is that we've done about 6 of these conversations in the last month now. And this is the first time your dog's really raised a ruckus. Every time you said some crazy Adams-like thing, your dogs barked in agreement, I think.
Yeah, I got 2 big Labradoodles here. One of them's really old and they can't see, but they're laying right behind me, and I think a car went by or something, or a truck. Nevertheless, I've enjoyed this, and thank you very much for allowing me into this podcast.
Oh,
our pleasure.
David, we've been getting some mail about Joseph Ellis and these conversations.
Yeah, we got a couple, and we got one from Dave Beatles, who has written to us a number of times, and I always read his email, and he listens to the podcast version, and he was a little upset with a show recently where you sort of asked a provocative question, Clay. It was like, which president would you want to be in charge during the pandemic?
Right. And Joe said that maybe John Kennedy or, maybe FDR or maybe Theodore Roosevelt. And then I said, which president would you least want to be in control?
Well, I have a suspicion that Dave Beatles wrote this email after listening to the show. You can tell by the typos he was a little upset. Anyway, he writes, if Trump had taken national control, you would have not been happy either. On TV today, the governor of Oklahoma is saying, start the opening phase, yet the mayor of Norman, Oklahoma says no. All politics are local. Why? Because situations are different in different cities. Any response to that?
Of course.
All politics is local. Unfortunately, the virus doesn't recognize county lines and or state lines. And the virus is not just national, it's global. But from our point of view, in the United States, what happens in Oklahoma ultimately affects what happens to me in Vermont.
Beatles goes on to say Trump directed the country exactly as it should have been. Quote, what do you need? Okay, you got it. When Jefferson was president, should the virus hit the U.S., should he have told all of our states and the Louisiana Territory to lock down? No. Discuss the other side of the coin.
Well, this is a false dichotomy. Nobody is saying that there should, not Joe is saying that there should be one single overarching, no exception, absolute national lockdown standard for the country. Obviously, the sparsely populated parts of Alaska and sparsely populated places in Wyoming need less social control than Detroit or Los Angeles or New York City or Newark, New Jersey. We all get that. But Joe is right, too, in saying that the implications of someone being infected in Montana and then, say, flying a plane to Newark International can change the whole equation. So we need both. And, there's room in our system. The 10th Amendment is an important part of our social compact. There's room for state governments and for the dual sovereign. And no one's altogether disputing that. But I think by any standards, and Joe, you tell me if I'm wrong, this administration, the national administration, has given unclear, self-defeating advice, much of it unscientific. There's been very mixed messaging from the very beginning about how people should handle this, a lot of mythology and a lot of pseudoscience. And I think what everyone wants is whatever the role of the national government is, to be clear, to be scientifically based, to involve actual coordination with the governors and the mayors of the country, and not to provide a series of mixed messages day by day and sometimes even hour by hour. I think you agree with that, don't you, Joe?
I do, and I don't want to break into an anti-Trump rant that voices the other side in its demeanor, but I think that I'll give you one example. I think we desperately need to put together a national team. The Manhattan Project is a kind of model. We need a vaccine as quickly as we can get it. We have the best scientists in the world. Let's get the best together on a national program to move forward on this vaccine and get it months earlier than we otherwise would get it. We similarly need a testing program to be able to find out how many of us had the disease or do not. That can be done only with a national program. It's going to take something like 300,000 people to do the testing, and let's put a military man like the guy that ran the response to that hurricane down in New Orleans. He was a military man. I forget his name, but he was a general. He did a great job. Bring him back. Put him in charge of that. But you can't let each governor decide what to do, and you can't let each mayor decide what to do on those matters. It would be almost like saying, we're going to war. If you people in Oklahoma don't want to go, you don't have to. No, this is, we're into a crisis situation. This is a matter of national security, and we need to be able to respond to it as a nation.
Forgive me, Clay, but I'm going to end his letter here, and it's pretty rough on you.
Sure, of
course. Again, this is from one of our listeners, Dave Beatles. He says, Clay has become so one-sided, showing his disdain for President Trump, that all balance has gone from your discussion over the past 3 years. Let's discuss Clay's strong dislike for almost everything our president does. Are you pandering to your base? Why have you become so divisive in your discussions? Let's have someone on the program that gives it a counterbalance. Well, I'm being you, Dave Beatles, in that position, and I could respond to that, but I'll let you.
Well, let me just say this much about this. First of all, I wasn't a big fan of Barack Obama either. His executive orders really troubled me from a constitutional point of view. He turned out to be a really inspiring and brilliant campaigner, and somewhat uninspiring as the sitting president. And he did not have the capacity that LBJ had to get in people's face and do the horse trading and sit down with them and find their weaknesses and strengths and really use the Machiavellian capacities of a president to get things done. So I don't want to be seen as a partisan here, but I will say this, that if you're a Jeffersonian, you cannot admire Donald Trump. His deportment, his lack of civility, his deficit in empathy, his disruptions of really important American institutions like justice, the Supreme Court, what he calls the deep state, including things like the CDC, and getting rid of inspector generals who exist merely to keep our government on track and to make sure that the executive agencies are doing what the congressional intent suggested and so on. I get that Donald Trump is a disruption agent, and he was elected for it, and we have to respect that. I think Jefferson would respect the people have spoken, although narrowly and not in their popular vote, but they did speak in 2016. But I don't think that Jefferson could possibly find much to admire in the 45th president of the United States. So if this is the Jefferson Hour, and we're trying to project Jefferson carefully into a world that he didn't live to see, I don't think he's going to find much to admire in the character of Donald Trump or in his administrative capacity or his constitutional theories. And then one final thing, and I know I'm going to sound like a partisan here, but only 2 or 3 times in a lifetime do you feel that you have a moral imperative to stand up and make your voice heard. And I personally feel that while some of President Trump's policies and his instincts about things that need to be adjusted, like NAFTA and our relationship with NATO and the fairness of the Paris Climate Accords and so on, those things needed to be addressed. I don't think he's addressed them very well, but I think that President Trump is a danger to the constitutional order of the United States that was created by the Founding Fathers and the American dream as articulated by Jefferson, and that people who really care about this country have to be willing to be heard. I didn't feel that way about George W. Bush. I didn't feel that way about George Herbert Walker Bush. I didn't feel that way about Barack Obama. I didn't feel that way about even Ronald Reagan. But I feel that way now. And if you don't speak out at a moment like this, then what are you anyway? Moral courage is the central characteristic of each of the historical characters that I've examined. I'll throw it to Joe, who will duck this because he's so much more genial. But the central character of John Adams, as seen above all in the run-up to the quasi-war and its aftermath, was to have the moral courage to do the unpopular thing and to stand up for integrity and virtue as he understood it, whether it made him popular or not. That kind of moral courage is in very, very short supply in the 21st century. It was a much bigger deal in the age of John Adams, and it cost him what he dearly wanted, which was a second term after which he would retire as a celebrated American successor to George Washington. So I'm not going to back off from my belief that this is really a dangerous moment in American life. But Joe, you wrap it up.
You've spoken for me there as much as for yourself. I don't want to duck it. I just add that I think that I've over the years been on the road since Trump's presidency and appeared in public forums, not nearly as often as you had over your time, Clay. And I've found that it's virtually impossible to have a dialogue with someone who's an ardent Trump supporter, that they occupy a position that they believe in ardently for reasons that I cannot comprehend. And evangelicals who view Trump as one of their own, a man of who does not, in my view, exhibit the kind of moral values that most good Christians would want, and down the road with a whole bunch of other things. And so I would ask them to explain themselves to me, and it seldom happens. And so I don't believe we're being partisan in our criticism of Mr. Trump, President Trump. I believe we're being good Americans.
Clay has often used the phrase that elections matter and elections have consequences. And I readily accept that, and I accept that a president comes into office and his agenda is his agenda, and we have to respect that. That's part of the process. But as an average American voter, I expect my president to do a couple of things. One of those things is unite the country as best is possible. And the other is to provide us with a vision of where our country is going. And I think Trump has failed massively on both of those accounts. That's one of the reasons I so enjoy the time I spend on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, because it gives me a historical vision of what presidents can actually do, and it's a lot. And it's not a party thing. I mean, there are Republicans I would vote for readily. I might not agree with them all, with all of their policies, but they're decent men. And that's what I want. So I'll close with that.
Well, let me close the thing by trying to be more cheerful. First of all, we've got Joseph Ellis, this amazing historian who's written more than a dozen books, outstanding, central reading to anyone who wants to understand the founding generation of American history. This is not some guy who's been watching MSNBC and now wants to spout off. This is somebody who's read the hard books. He's looked at the documents. He's been in the National Archives. He's wrestled with the character of Washington, the character of Adams, the character of Jefferson, the character of Hamilton, the character of Franklin, Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, and on and on and on. We're talking about somebody who is a major figure in our understanding of the founding generation of American history. And if he doesn't have the right to be a little disillusioned with this president or that, then the humanities mean absolutely nothing. It's been a privilege for us to have Joe Ellis on. He's going to continue to return, and we make no apology for that. And if he happens to believe that Donald Trump is not the best president for this moment in American history, if that offends you, then you're easily offended, because believe me, Joseph Ellis has earned the right to have the views that he have, and the rest of us need to look to that, not with a sense of unlimited respect, because everybody brings their own temperament and their own perspective to all that they do and say. But we also need to understand that this is not just something that's coming from a handful of talking points being handed out at a coffee shop somewhere. So all praise to our friend Joseph Ellis. And with your permission, sir, I have one more round of questions that have nothing to do with President Trump or the pandemic to ask you next week on a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
I'll be here.
Thank you so much for all of your contributions, Joe. It's just a pleasure to have you on the show, and it's very important. We thank you.
All right.
And with that, let's go to this week's show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and with me is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And I'll leave it to you, Clay, to introduce our special guest.
Indeed, the pandemic series of the Thomas Jefferson Hour continues. I'm delighted to be able to say that our dear friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, now an emeritus professor living at an undisclosed location in Vermont, somewhere in the Green Mountains with Ethan Allen and his cohort of rapscallions, is joining us again for this ongoing conversation about John Adams, and in particular, the relationship between the second president of the United States, John Adams, and the third, Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, good to be with you. You're right. I'm on top of a mountain here in central Vermont, and it's a little lower than Monticello, but I do have moments of Jeffersonian epiphany up here periodically.
We're just going to assume that you live in Palladian grandeur.
No, that's not the case. Though it's more than what you described in previous conversations as a bit of a shack. It's a nice place. It's comfortable, and my dogs love it, and I can feel closer to the earth here. You know.
How did you find it?
My wife found it. She's a skier, and she wanted to ski at Okemo and became an instructor. That's a major ski resort here, and it's about 2 hours drive from our home in Amherst, Massachusetts.
You know, I haven't really disclosed the exact nature of your house there, your cabin, because I'm afraid that angry mobs will turn up, and you will be you'll be smuggling in guns through the back door to defend your life against these turbulent members of self-proclaimed democratic societies. You know, a couple of episodes ago, I believe you said that the current incumbent of the White House is the last person you would want to be in charge of a international crisis like this. And I think it's time for you to eat crow. I'm sure you've heard that he has now recommended that you inject yourself with disinfectant.
Yes, I heard that. I thought that confirmed my assessment, but let's make this less Trumpian and more Jeffersonian.
I'm all for that, my friend.
All right.
So you have been thinking about Adams. You know, we've had this interesting dialogue, and you called me the other day and said you have some thoughts. Well,
the thought was that we've focused for good historical reasons on the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson between 1813 and 1826, when, as everybody now knows, everybody's listened, they died on the same day, which was the 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration, publication of the Declaration, and but that's a very rich correspondence, and I tried to introduce our listeners to some of the wonderful and almost just hilarious moments, as well as some profound moments. But one of the central issues of the correspondence that we didn't focus on, that has relevance for us today, is their debate about what they called the few and the many, and it's a debate about equality and what it means, and they don't agree on it. And the reasons they don't agree are still alive and present with us. And so the dialogue itself recovers what still is a central problem in American political life, and I thought we ought to talk about it.
All right, the few and the many. I believe I'm trying to remember on a couple of occasions this subject comes up in this late correspondence, and Jefferson says this: the struggle between the few and the many is not recent. It's as ancient as civilization. If you read Greek, or if you look at the tumults of the Roman Republic, you realize that this is one of the dynamisms of all civilization, that the few try to protect their power and the many are resentful, and that different political figures align themselves either with the few and the many, and that there's not much to be done about it, that this is just a central dynamic of the nature of politics.
Let me give you the direct quote here. I got it right in front of me, Clay, but it's what you say, but it's for our listeners, here it is. This is Jefferson. The same political parties which now agitate the United States have existed through all time, whether the power of the people or that of the aristoi, or aristocracy, shall prevail, were questions which kept the states of Greece and Rome in eternal convulsions. To me, it appears there have been party differences from the first establishment of governments to the present day. Everyone takes his side in favor of the many or the few. And he thinks this is a reasonably innocent topic that doesn't risk another eruption from John Adams, who's, volcanic in his character. And initially Adams says, yeah, that's true. But then he starts to complicate Jefferson's categories. And the aristoi was a subject that Jefferson had, in fact, urged him to be writing about for a long time. And he claimed he'd been writing about it forever. And the only problem, he says, the only problem being that I've been so unfortunate as to never make myself understood. But Jefferson seems to believe that equality is the natural order. And that's rather prominently displayed in the first words of the second paragraph of the Declaration, that all men are created equal. And Adams doesn't believe that. He believes that all men have equal rights as human beings, all men and women, mankind. And so perhaps in some sort of lofty humanistic sense, this is true. But in all the worldly ways, Adams thinks that it's really an illusion. He says somewhere, I think I got it in my mind here, inequalities of mind and body are so established by God Almighty in the constitution of human nature that no art or policy can ever plane them down to the same level. And I got this, here's a quote. He says, I have never read reasoning more absurd, sophistry more gross in proof of the Athanasian Creed or transubstantiation than the subtle labors to demonstrate the natural equality of mankind. So he thinks the idea of human equality, which Jefferson is the main proponent of, is a myth. I've spoken a little bit. What do you think? Am I being fair to Adams here?
Of course. So that key phrase, no matter what legislators do, you can't, quote, plane them down to a level. That would presumably be John Adams' response to Vladimir Lenin and to Karl Marx and to Stalin and to all of the communists and believers in that you can create a square deal in such a way that every human being has equal prospects in life. Adams would just scoff at that and say, we may start equal.
Yeah, and he didn't know that Lenin was coming, or Marx, although there's a quotation somewhere, let me see here, it's almost Marxist. After all, he says, and this is to Jefferson, as long as property exists, it will accumulate in individuals and families. I repeat, so long as the idea and existence of property is admitted and established in society, accumulations of it will be made, and the snowball will grow as it rolls. So, again, the word capitalism doesn't yet exist. The word capital does, but the word capitalism doesn't come into existence until 1851. But that he's saying that whenever you have a society that's based on the concept of property as the central economic reality, you're going to get a maldistribution of wealth. and that, and I mean, I'll start Jefferson's response, but you top it off because you'll say it more eloquently than I can say it. But what Jefferson is saying is that we've created a new kind of society in America, and it's going to be a Jeffersonian society. And it's going to be a society of natural equality. Now, not perfect equality, but it's going to become the kind of world that is, in fact, 5 years later, the world described by Francis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. Well, he visits in 1831 and publishes the first volume of Democracy in America in 1835. It's the first middle-class society in recorded history. America discovers the middle class, invents it. And there are reasons why that's true. And I'll start it out by saying, Jefferson says, we're not a feudal society. We've done away with primogeniture and entail, with other vestiges of feudalism. And we've got this huge trust fund out there, this land mass to the west, which we've acquired in the war. And then later on, it will be expanded by Jefferson himself in the Louisiana Purchase. And this really gives us an enormous asset. And that also contributes mightily and quite palpably to the fact that there will always be a place for people to move to own their own land, and to become self-sufficient farmers, and to live a life of rough equality, and that nothing in Europe is like this. And therefore, my views of equality aren't just pie-in-the-sky reifications, idealistic, utopian ideas. They're grounded in the demographic reality of the United States.
All right, Joe, I agree with you, of course. But Jefferson is not just an nincompoop utopian. What he wants to do is to clear away the bulwarks, the infrastructure, the flying buttresses that have held up class hierarchies and privileged the aristocrats and the plutocrats and the powerful. He says if you remove all the artificial props that have held up these people who don't really deserve to be the best and the most powerful and the wealthiest and the most privileged with the most access and the most enjoyment of the fruits of life, if you get rid of those artificial things and then try again, we won't reach actual equality. Of course, we can't plane everyone down to a level, but we will get closer than you can possibly imagine. And that's the first step.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're speaking this week with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and the noted author and historian, Professor Joseph Ellis. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking about the few and the many. We're speaking with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and Professor Joseph Ellis. I was very interested in the first part of the conversation. We were talking about Jefferson's knowledge of two parties struggling against one another. In previous conversations with you, Clay, you've always kind of left me with the impression that a lot of the founding fathers were surprised at the partisanship that occurred after the Revolution.
All of them were. They all pretended.
Jefferson's distinct. I mean, they all were. Washington was. Adams was. They didn't foresee political parties. They thought of political parties in the same way that we think now of lobby groups.
And yet, this letter that you read, Jefferson acknowledges that that's happened since the time of the Greeks and Romans.
What he's talking about is not organized political parties so much as ways of thinking about the society that are different and dominating. And one is the power of the few and the other is of the many. Jefferson once said, if I must go to heaven in a political party, I prefer not to go at all. And he said that at the same time as he and Madison were setting up what becomes the Republican Party. And it's not the Democratic Republican, it's called the Republican Party in 1793, 94, 95. So that he is absolute enemy of parties, but another part of him is capable of becoming a party leader, which is what he does.
The other thing that Clay has educated me on is how much France led to Jefferson's beliefs. There's a letter that he wrote to James Madison from France about the property of this country is absolutely concentrated in a very few hands. But after all, there comes the most numerous of all classes, that is, the poor who cannot find work. So, Joe, do you think that it was his experiences in France that led Jefferson to believe this?
Well, it confirmed some of the presumptions he was carrying in his head that Europe was the past. Europe was a place where the values of equality had never been able to take hold. And the peasantry of France that he saw as he was especially driving south or riding, he wasn't driving a car, he was riding in a carriage south to take a look at the architecture. He was struck by the poverty of the people and said that the poorest person in America looks very well-to-do indeed compared to the poor of France. And but I think that he really does believe that that's a European social structure that no longer need to be worried about in America, because we have a fundamentally different kind of society that we've created here. And I don't think he would be saying that's what we thought we were doing when we started the American Revolution, but it turns out that's what we were doing. We were creating a new world. Thomas Paine felt similarly about it, and a place where every man and woman had an opportunity to pursue his own happiness and to enjoy success based on his own commitment and work. And that, so it's a contrast in his mind between the past and the present. The past is Europe, the present and the future is America.
Ah, I see.
So let me jump in here for a moment. I think I can explain a little of this. So Jefferson said, if I could only go to heaven at the head of a party, I would rather not go at all. That was 1787. He does wind up inadvertently, or semi-inadvertently, becoming the leader of the opposition party. But here's how he looked at it. And one thing that Joseph Ellis has taught me is that Jefferson was able to convince himself of things that are palpably suspect, but that he's not faking it, that he actually somehow talks himself into believing these things. So he actually argues in a number of his letters that 95% or more of the American people are on his side, and a tiny elite has grabbed hold of the country and is in danger of turning it towards another British-style constitutional monarchy, or possibly even a hereditary monarchy, but that group, the High Federalists, represent no more than a couple of percentage points of the entire American population. And this is not a party problem of two nearly equal factions. This is that the vast and overwhelming majority of the American people have been usurped by a self-selected elite, and they only need to sort of shrug this silly thing off and retake the country for themselves. So this isn't a party thing. This is really about a usurpation. That's how he saw it in his own mind, and he wanted to keep it that way by preserving an agrarian society and a diffused society rather than one concentrated in cities, because he thought that people who live in cities are ripe to be manipulated by self-serving demagogues. And so that's the illusion that Jefferson lived under. We know that that's not quite true, but it worked for him.
No, I mean, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin were all part of the conspiracy, I guess.
Yeah, he thought so.
And so he comes back from France and says the whole world has changed. It hadn't. I mean, the same people that won the revolution were running the government. But yes, he did convince himself of that. And he created this body of evidence called what do they call it? The ANAS, A-N.
The ANAS, right? The ANAS, the ANAS, yeah.
They published it, and he wrote it, I think, in like 1815, 1816.
In his retirement.
Yeah. And so it's his way of explaining ex post facto in a somewhat falsified way how he came to take the position he did as the head of what becomes a party. And it follows just what Clay had said. But it's a conspiracy theory.
The great irony of American history is that Jefferson was right in the short term, that a very solid majority of Americans were Republicans of his stamp, and only a relative minority and a shrinking minority were Federalists of his designation. So Jefferson wins the struggle against the Hamiltonians and the high Federalists in his time, brings on the administration of Thomas Jefferson for 8 years, the administration of his handpicked protege Madison for 8 years, the administration of their handpicked protege Monroe for 8 years, the so-called era of good feelings. The Virginians dominate the country. They believe that history's over and the problem has been solved now because the Federalists have been vanquished once and for all. That's how Jefferson saw it, although there was a little bit of a darkening of his mood in the last few years of his life. But what we know, Joe, is that in the long run, the Hamiltonians were right and Jefferson was wrong. He was clinging to an agrarian paradigm that could not be sustained.
I agree with that last thing. And I think that and what I'd add is that the 1790s, I wrote a book about the 1790s once called Founding Brothers.
See, here we go again. Oh, yeah, that reminds me of a book I wrote.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book. I'm sorry.
It's a great book.
Forgive me.
We know we love it. Keep going.
But the point of it is that almost all republics flounder in their earliest years, and they become tyrannies or oligarchies or what have you.
The French Republic, for example.
French Republic. This is the pattern. The Roman Republic, England under Cromwell. And that what saves America from this is the Federalists, who create a viable federal government that can help manage the economy and provide stability during these early years of our existence as the first nation-sized republic in world history. And so to vilify them as somehow take a hostile takeover of the American Revolution, they saw themselves, and John Marshall, another prominent one, wrote about this, as the fulfillment.
As saving the republic.
Yeah. From the forgive the dog behind me here, but at any rate, I think that what we've got here is fundamentally two different versions of what they thought the American Revolution really meant, but also two very different views about what role government should play in any kind of viable republic. And you see that in a Jeffersonian world, you don't need much government, and the less government, the better. In the Adams world and the Federalist world, government is us, not them. Government is a useful, not just useful, essential part of the kind of republic that we want to have. I mean, and therefore that what you've got here in the correspondence is the debate between whether we think government is us or government is them. And in this moment of pandemic, all those people who genuinely believed that the government is an evil empire or the deep state, I think are beginning to reconsider that, at least in this crisis situation, because it's absolutely essential for us to manage our way effectively through this thing. I think Jefferson believed in something he called self-government, and that was a term he used all the time. And what he meant was that in a crisis like this, people will self-quarantine. You don't have to have anybody to force them to do that. They will do it because it's the right thing to do. And Adams says, well, not all of them and not as much as we need, and we need government. And so this is obviously still a very much a live issue in our political world, But its origins in American history go right back to this debate they're having in the early 19th century.
Well, yes, of course, but I want to go back to this notion of Jefferson's. I don't want to leave him looking like a utopian ninny. That Jefferson
he's utopian, but he's not a ninny. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. He's naive, but he's not a ninny. So he believes that you can't plane humanity down to a level, of course, but you can plane it down more than we have. And you don't want a big government to do that. That's going to be the paradox for Jefferson. He doesn't want big government, but he does want the ends that only a large government can bring about. And so he wants to plane it down, and he thinks abolishing primogeniture and abolishing entail. And then, as he said in a letter to Madison from France, maybe some kind of benign redistribution of wealth from time to time. But we have to do what we can, both to pull out all the props that have artificially held up class hierarchies, and we have to empower the natural aristoi, what we would call the meritocrats, by some sort of societal incentivizing, societal encouragement. And if we do that, maybe we get closer to a world in which all men are created equal is less of a contingent kind of a claim.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and that's what he thought, and I think it's a good vision, and I would actually suggest it holds true for much of the 19th century until you get to the Civil War and after, because of the land, that we are a roughly equal society, more equal than any society had ever been created before in modern history, and or even in not just modern, but in medieval and classical history as well. What Adams is saying is that's temporary, that unless human nature is somehow changed in the trip from Europe to across the Atlantic to America, it is built in that we're going to end up producing inequality. And the people with the wealth are going to use the wealth to buy the government. And they're going to create a plutocracy. And that's what always happens. And we should expect that to happen here too. And that when it happens, the only way to stop it is to use government to create a greater degree of equality so that there is not a top 1% in our current world that can buy the government and control things as a plutocracy. Now, this is what happens in the late 19th century. It's called the Gilded Age. It's what happened now in the United States in the late 20th and early 21st century, and we're living it now. It's a second Gilded Age. It is a plutocracy. And in that sense, I'm arguing in the long run, Adams was right, and Jefferson was wrong. But, I mean, I don't think you can condemn Jefferson for not foreseeing everything. And that his vision did hold true for 50 or 60 years.
I believe that it continues to have possibilities. A couple of things. First of all, Jefferson said history on the whole teaches us only what bad government has been. So he wants to jettison all of history. It doesn't provide, maybe human nature is not invariably the same. Maybe there is a break between Southampton and Plymouth in England and Plymouth in New England. Maybe the American dream that we have it in our power to begin the world over again, maybe there's more to it than we think. And so he wants to say, how do we know? Because humans have been oppressed by haughty religions, by aristocrats, by kings, by feudalism, by superstition and ignorance. We don't know what humans are capable of because we've never given them the wherewithal to show what they can really do. And then let me quote, before you respond, from the first inaugural address, which I think is it's sort of the Jefferson music, but it is worth considering. He says, sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question.
Well, that sounds like Madison to me almost, But is that in the first inaugural?
Yeah.
Yeah, the famous line is, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, or something.
Well, actually, he said we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. He wasn't going to give up that much.
He wants place of prominence. Okay, I got it. Well, I think that there's an exchange that you recalled in the correspondence where Adams responds to his notion that there will emerge a kind of natural aristocracy of the wise and the good, and that what Jefferson calls the tinsel aristocracy, the Europeanocracy.
The pseudo-aristocracy, yes.
I love the word tinsel aristocracy. That's no good, and that's artificial, and we don't like those people. But as long as, and when he's talking about the natural aristocracy, you know who he's talking about. He's talking about him and Adams. And
William Short and Meriwether Lewis and Monroe.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about the founders. He's talking about that generation. And
right.
But what Adams says is, look, there are three pillars, and I don't have it before me. That one is the first. Well, there's five
strength,
pillars: birth, wealth, and I forget the other one, and then beauty, birth, and wealth, and then there's talent and virtue, and that the first three can defeat the last two every time. He said even philosophers, if marrying their daughters, will always prefer someone of wealth and birth to someone of virtue, and they got all mixed up too. I mean, you know, people with talent, but who are not born with a trust fund, or who, on the other side, people with talent who are born into impoverishment, their future is not that bright. And so he is saying that inequality will always result. The best will not necessarily be the wealthy people, and wealth will control wisdom. Wealth will dominate the best people, and that is inevitable. And that unless you find a way to counter it, and the only way to do that is with government.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break from this conversation. We'll return to it in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with Professor Joseph Ellis and the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. You're talking, sirs, about the few and the many. And I have to say, in listening to the previous part of the conversation, how much of this seems strangely contemporary to me. You know, you're talking about how the wealthy use power to control government, and it makes me think of a senator from Vermont who was running for president. Very much makes me think of Bernie Sanders. Some of the things you were talking about, Joe.
Yeah, Bernie is in that category. The government is us, and I'm sitting in his home state. I think the major spokesman for the other side now might be Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. And I was reading in the New Yorker a long piece on McConnell recently, just this week, in which when he's young and he's teaching a course in politics at the University at Louisville, he begins the course and he says, there are three things that you need to know about politics. And he writes the three words on the board: money, money, and money.
I've heard that story. Are we saying that Bernie is our century's Jeffersonian?
No, because Bernie is our century's Adams.
Really?
Yeah, because Bernie wants government to come in and redistribute wealth, and Jefferson doesn't want that. Bernie is saying, in order to achieve the ends of Jefferson, we need to use the means of Adams.
That's that's kind of a good combo, isn't it?
Well, it is. But you remember, Bernie's not going to be the nominee. I think Bernie's the leader of a movement. And I will say this, the values of Jeffersonian America, if you ride around Vermont, you can see them because it's a thinly populated area, land. There's not much industry at all. It's agrarian. what happens if you're a Jeffersonian and you remove government from any regulation or control of the economy, is you end up getting the Great Depression, because the economy expands too fast and eventually self-destructs. But you also get inequality and a government in which the wealth dominates what a democratic majority wants, and what is possible given the existence of this plutocracy are two very different things.
Well, if we go back to the goal, so I think Adams and Jefferson, if you said, okay, what's the goal? I think they would agree on this, that we want to be a republic. Jefferson is a little more trusting. Adams is a little less trusting. Equality is a great ideal. Adams says, well, there's just no way we can get there. And Jefferson's probably going to concede a fair amount of that. But he says, well, let's try. So you have this idea. So then the question becomes, what's the mechanism that creates the widest possible middle class and the most social resistance to the creation of a rigid class hierarchy or a pseudo-aristocracy? And Jefferson's going to say education, 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 but adding what Joe says, and if you can buy the Louisiana Territory from time to time, you want to do that too.
That sort of helps, yeah.
Adams is going to say, I think, yeah, but you know what? None of these things, you can educate people to the nth degree, Mr. Jefferson, but their human nature will out. The universal human rage for distinction and to lord it over somebody can't be extinguished by law or education or anything else. You can maybe chip away at it, but you'd better plan for it. And if you don't plan for it, you're going to be disappointed again and again and again with all of your social engineering.
That's close to what I agree with. I would only say that Adams is a big proponent of education too, and in his draft of the Massachusetts Constitution, which he wrote single-handedly, open education for everybody from grade school up through what we would call high school is provided for, is required, as a matter of fact, on a county-by-county basis where taxes have to be allocated for that purpose. And Massachusetts leads the way into the 19th century in terms of the development of a public education system, Horace Mann, et cetera. That all comes out of Adams. So they both believe in education, but the rest of what you said sounds pretty right to me. I think that Adams doesn't question Jefferson's motives. He questions his judgment about how, in fact, human beings are going to function once we run out of the land.
Okay, but let me just make the case for the American dream, and I know you're going to agree with me, Joe. There was a time in my lifetime, in the late 50s and early 60s, when prominent Southern intellectuals, not just politicians, said, the fact is African Americans just aren't up to it, and we're just going to have to face that. And there was a time in my lifetime when it was said that women can't drive and women should not be pilots and women could never be a Supreme Court justice and women can't be involved in warfare and women can't be CEOs because they just don't have it. They're too tied to their uterus and their emotional makeup isn't set for this. And there was a time in my lifetime when it was thought that American Indians were going to always be a pauper class that was going to require a trust relationship by the federal government, and on and on and on. And we've seen all of those barriers fall. We've seen a widening of American respect for minorities. African Americans are achieving such things that only a really pronounced racist can say they're not up to it anymore, although some do. Women are now 51% of all of the students in our colleges and universities, and way more than that in our law schools, and are beginning to take a real place in Americans, the top echelons of American corporate business and so on. We've seen so much change in my lifetime, and you're only a little bit older than I am, Joe, that the American dream continues to deliver and widen the suffrage and widen respect and widen legal protection of rights. There are setbacks, to be sure, and we're living in a very uncertain moment. But you have to say, Jefferson's optimism about American possibilities has largely been borne out.
Yeah, but what you're describing is the expansion of the American promise, the one that Jefferson gave lyrical expression to in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are their rights. And I think the expansion of those liberties occurred in the most of them in the first half of the 20th century. And they occurred under the New Deal and the Great Society.
Yeah, we're retrenching. There's no question.
That they occurred under Roosevelt and
through Nixon.
And through Nixon, through two Republican presidents, Eisenhower and Nixon, maintained that posture. And so this is where Jeffersonian goals were achieved in ways that Jefferson himself did not endorse.
Yes.
And so, if we want the Jeffersonian dream to continue, and the American who is most articulate about this is Lincoln. Really, Lincoln is the guy who says ending slavery is implicit in the Jeffersonian promise. And that promise is something we'll never reach. It's like the Holy Grail that we keep going for, but we can't quite grab. But moving closer to it is the name of the game, and what we each do in each of our generations. Once you, however, get a plutocracy, it blocks all that. None of the reforms that you described have happened over the last 20 years. Or maybe they have in the terms of women's.
The Americans with Disabilities Act, the granting of rights to gay couples. Some of it continues.
That's true, but those were over the dead bodies of some conservatives. And but what you're just describing is a liberal interpretation of American history. And what liberalism came to mean in the 20th century is a proper role of government to regulate the markets and the corporations. And I would think, for example, our listeners out there, many of them till the land. They're farmers. Those people are heavily dependent on government. They're now plowing under their crops because it's produced too much of a surplus. They're being granted several $1 billion in government handouts. And it's not a handout, but for the fact that the Trump policy towards China has taken away their markets in Asia, and the west of the Mississippi has been developed by government more than any other section of the country because of the Transcontinental Railroad, the irrigation systems that made those lands fertile, the dams, and so that we achieved many of the facets of the promise by the collective commitment through government. And I think we're in the midst of a current epidemic and crisis where it's absolutely clear we need a national response to this, not a state-by-state response. And again, I think Adams is relevant, and Jefferson, I don't know what Jefferson would say.
Let me ask you that question. We're getting close to the end of the program, unfortunately, but let me ask you the hardest of all questions, and that is one I wrestle with every day. Would Jefferson have grown with the country until today he would be in favor of gay marriage and would understand the Americans with Disabilities Act? Would he have grown with the country, or would he be a hidebound Southerner of the kind we all are familiar with from the 1960s?
That's an unanswerable question because you can't run the tape and try to bring him back.
You've got to have a hunch.
He is a believer in science and scientific,
and progress.
Yeah, progress, and that what he calls the progress of the human mind, and he's always in touch with what's going on most recently. I think that in many, many ways he would have evolved and would have accepted the changes and been proud to do it. The one area I'm not so sure about is race, because I think that he believed that blacks were inherently inferior. Now, would he have changed his thinking about that? I don't know. But he was, in his own time, even more conservative. The liberal position in the late 18th century was to say that it was all a function of environment, and that over time, blacks would become the equal of whites after they get out of slavery. He didn't think that. In fact, my mentor at Yale, Ed Morgan, once wrote a book called American Slavery, American Freedom, which features Jefferson a great deal. that one of the reasons that Jefferson believed that this was where freedom was going to have such a robust presence in America is that he presumed that there would be a laboring class that would take care of that didn't really count as citizens. They were the black slaves. So slavery permitted him to think more extravagantly about the beauties of freedom. And that's a paradox, to be sure, but I think Morgan was right in that book.
Boy, I don't agree with that, but I take your point. You know, when I was a boy, if you were a racist, and there were racists everywhere, it was still possible to make the following sentence. I do not endorse it, but it was still possible to say, show me the black achievement. Show me that they're up to it. Today, when you look around, if you turn on any cable news network, the sociologists, the philosophers, the physicians, the political figures, the foundation heads, the scientists, you see examples of African-American achievement in every direction. And if you closed your eyes and looked at the television set in a colorblind way, you wouldn't be able to know that one was black and one was white, or one was Asian and one was Native American. If Jefferson's mantra was "show me black achievement," that battle is over. No, there's still huge pockets of black ignorance, but that's over now.
The majority of white voters did not vote for Barack Obama.
No, I know there's still racism, but I'm saying it's harder and harder and harder to maintain on the argument of show me the achievement.
I think it should be, but I think we're living through a backlash moment right now in which some of the more despicable human beings who are white are no longer at the fringe, but at the mainstream of the conversation.
If Adams were elected president in 2020, what would he attend to?
He would name a czar to create a national program to recover from the pandemic, and
that's got to be Hamilton, even though he hates him.
No, well, he hated him, but they agreed with. They disagreed on political principles. He hated him as a human being, and with good reason.
If you could draft anyone from history to solve that problem, to be his economic czar, it's got to be Hamilton, right?
Maybe Robert Morris. You heard of Robert Morris?
Of course, but he went to debtor's prison.
Morris was Hamilton's mentor, really. Yeah, and yeah, you're right. You're right. I mean, as long as you keep Hamilton in that one little category and don't let him escape and become head of any army anywhere.
You can't let him off the leash.
You can't let him off the leash. That's right. And but I mean, I think that of the presidents that we need, I mean, Adams would be good now. Lincoln would be great now.
Theodore Roosevelt.
There's a bunch. Theodore Roosevelt. I asked you earlier in one of the earlier weeks, who would you pick to run the country during the pandemic? And you said, and I said, you're familiar with two presidents very, very intimately. One is Jefferson and one is Theodore Roosevelt. I think it's a slam dunk that it's got to be Theodore Roosevelt that you want to be. I mean, I can't see it possible you can pick Jefferson.
Well, I know that Roosevelt would take a firmer hand, and I know you're looking for a firmer hand. I think the apotheosis of Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo is, I'm going to sound like a 10th Amendment guy here for a moment, Joe, but I think this is good for the country to see these gifted governors making a run and showing that we do have a federalist system, and it is a laboratory of democracy, and some states are failing the test and other states are passing the test, and we're seeing what you have when you enable a decentralized dual sovereign system. It has many problems, but it has some real benefits too.
It does, and I think the role the governments are playing is always been true, and it's more vocal, it's more explicit and visible now. But I think that it also means that when states like Georgia and other states of the old Confederacy open up, they're going to extend the epidemic, and that's going to be a second wave that's going to kill many of us.
I know. Joe, as you can see, however hard we try, you can't help being an Adamsite, and I can't help being a Jeffersonian.
That's true, but I also think that they ended up as friends.
And we're friends.
And we're still friends. We'll
always be friends. I love your point of view.
Yes.
And I have this, unlike Jefferson, I have this nagging suspicion that you're probably right, and it kills me late at night when I wake up and I think Joe's probably right about this.
I have the same feeling.
We've
Well,
so enjoyed this.
somebody said, whoever bet against Jefferson in American history has always lost.
But Sancho Panza always gets the last word, and that's Adams and that's you in this debate.
That's a great place to end this conversation, gentlemen. It's been such a pleasure to listen to the two of you.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And by the way, Joe's coming back.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.